Is Michael LeSueur, and I've been in tech, gosh, now 20 plus years. It's harder and harder to say that number. But in the last 10 specifically focused working with, security vendors, predominantly on kind of the network solutions side. And most recently, I've been with Vectra now a little more than 3.5 years. And depending again on how familiar you are with Vectra, kind of to Dane's point, I like to really keep it simple, but it's important you kind of understand kind of the context of what we'll be talking about today. And a simple way that I like to kind of explain what we do is we really are a threat research led data science company focused on security. Um, and so we build a platform that leverages really targeted behavioral based algorithms. And then we kind of automate that around machine learning and AI to detect and kind of prioritize what I consider post incursion, right? So insider, advanced persistent threats. That's really the goal of what we're going after from a behavioral standpoint. And really the goal of what we're trying to do, is finding these advanced attacks and correlating the associated, what we term as threat, how risky it is, and certainty, how well does it match the behavior we're trying to characterize in such a way that, the users of the platform can address early detection and prevent, potential breach. And again, we identify advanced attack behaviors that are difficult for what we call malicious actors to avoid. So we don't do everything. We really try to distill, behaviors that are valuable to malicious actors. And they haven't come up with other ways to kind of demonstrate a particular TTP. So that behavior or common method is something they use on a repetitive basis. So we zero in on that as it relates to command and control, reconnaissance, lateral, and exfil maneuvers to really, monitor as they kind of move through or progress through the attack kill chain to their objective. And so that's a little bit of background that I think is important from a context standpoint in terms of what we're going to go into for the next few minutes, because we're going to cover some fundamentals that make, Office 365, Microsoft 365 such a rich target for, attackers today. So, just a little bit about the dynamic transformation of, the environment we find ourselves in today. Again, just to provide a little more context. People often throw out digital transformation. Well, that's a journey I think that all of us have been on if we're in IT for the last 5+ years. In many ways, COVID from a pandemic accelerated this with a rapid shift to, remote work from home. Now every home office is, potentially part of the network. Obviously, cloud rapidly, becoming a bigger part of that network. It's no longer seen as sort of separate and to its own. And then, everyone now has a zero trust strategy, or at least has started sort of down the road of understanding, what kind of policy and what kind of enforcement looks like for potentially their enterprise when it comes to zero trust. But if I was to sort of sum up zero trust, it's really three key pillars, and this is sort of important as we think about the environment and the threat landscape as a whole, and what's kind of happening to kind of mitigate that. But if you think of zero trust, really the very basic strategy is I got to protect endpoints, I got to harden access to my cloud and data center environments, and I've got to be able to detect and pretty much monitor everything. Sounds pretty simple, but if you look at the what industry analysts are sort of saying about this zero trust kind of journey, most companies is going to be a multi-year kind of process to get there, and some analysts are even saying on average it is more like 5 to 7 years. So I say all of this in terms of context to kind of talk about the idea of attacks, regardless of any of the strategy, what sort of happened in the last 2 years with how COVID has sort of forced a rework in terms of how you and I go to work today. attacks remain, well hidden, and they leverage and use blind spots, across the data center, IoT network, and cloud. If anything, that's not gotten easier. It's gotten, certainly more and more complex. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of kind of why we're here. And to do that, when we talk about Office 365, or, I'll use Office 365 and, Microsoft 365 sort of interchangeably, but, Office 365 has sort of evolved into Microsoft 365. There are some differences in terms of the service, but in general, I'll sort of use them in the same way. So when you hear one, you can consider it to be both services. But in the SaaS world, Office 365 sort of has dominated the productivity space with what they used to track active monthly users. And I recently heard that half of all active Office 365 users leverage Microsoft Teams. And that, I don't know if you pay attention to that number. They haven't really called that number out in their Microsoft's financials for a few quarters, and that's on purpose. But that's a pretty big number given the kind of pre-pandemic Microsoft Teams, being sort of introduced, and the adoption of that, with a significant uptick kind of through the pandemic. For several years, Microsoft grew Office 365 active users at about 3 to 3.5 million users per month. So a 30 million uptick per annual basis was very typical in terms of growth for Office 365. I think it's probably slowed a little bit recently, given how fluid the workforce has been in terms of trying to determine what's going to happen post pandemic as we sort of creep out of this whole COVID experience. And then if you think of so I think the last number that I sort of could derive was somewhere around 325 million users. I think it's probably 6 months old, but they don't even call it active users anymore. Microsoft is changing the way they sort of track that, and they report that as paid seats. So again, the numbers are a little bit hard to follow. But the reason I bring all of this up is these are really big numbers. And if you even take a look at, for example, Azure AD, I think Microsoft says Azure AD now has close to 500 million, active users. So if you just think about all those numbers, what I'm really getting at is Office 365 is so core to the enterprise in terms of data sharing, storage, communications, which again really just make it an extremely rich data source. And it's no surprise that Office 365's become a big focus for attackers. And despite the adoption of things like multi-factor authentication, as well as other standard kind of security controls, financial, reputational damage from, kind of through Office 365 data breaches continues to be kind of a real factor today in terms of threat landscape. And of those breaches, specifically, we're going to talk about account takeover, which is really, kind of pre-COVID was one of the fastest growing and kind of most prevalent types of kind of attacks. So much that, attackers started focusing on account takeover rather than email compromise. And if you are in IT security and you follow any kind of reporting on an annual basis, email compromise has sort of been, the number one spot holder for, threats related to, businesses for the last, X amount of years. And so you see account takeover kind of pushing email compromise out of that number one spot potentially. And then the other thing I was going to mention is, Microsoft likes to call out how Office 365 has sort of generated, X billions of collaborating minutes in a single day. I don't know if anybody has heard, sometimes they'll call that out, just highlighting the growth, as people communicate, collaborate, co-author content across, work, life, and learning. This metric that Microsoft's calling out really, in my mind, reflects the changing nature of work, right? With Teams now really becoming a hub, Microsoft 365 brings honestly, the power of cloud to every person, giving them kind of this integrated experience in a new world of work that's, I think, forever changed in comparison to what it was like, pre kind of COVID. And so this is a huge kind of shift in terms of how we communicate. And the big piece of this is where we put data. It goes without saying that with this massive kind of adoption of Office 365 in this sort of new work from home environment where we're always sort of connected via cloud but don't actually connect directly to any computers anymore, kind of quite simply Office 365 has sort of become what I think is one of the number one attack surfaces. And so the pandemic sort of forced this into reality a little bit. And I don't think that will necessarily change because I don't think we'll ever really go back to the way it was pre-COVID. I do believe we kind of live in a changed world now. And so in the future, it's continuing. I believe it'll continue to kind of evolve in ways that we didn't really anticipate pre-COVID. But if you stop and think what's in Office 365 and kind of assess, well, why is it so valuable? It's when you think about it, it's pretty much we put everything there, and it's oversimplifying it. But if you step back, I think you would agree. And, it's not just email. It's certainly a lot of SharePoint, OneDrive, which is sort of becoming the filing system for corporate America. And most companies use it fairly religiously, and the majority of data, includes things like intellectual property, patents, secrets, customer data, trade secrets. It's everything. Essentially sits in some type of OneDrive or SharePoint to some degree. And if you think about maybe how you use some of those services on a personal level, in adopting similar type of behaviors based on convenience, I think it all sort of makes sense. That even personally we've adopted sort of those types of trends in terms of how we're using services like that. And when you look at the Office 365 offering at a high level, the suite of apps are all interconnected as part of that Office 365 environment. And this means anything of value for a public or private company relying on Microsoft sits within that Office 365 environment. So this is true for the company I work for Vectra. And pretty much when I engage and talk to customers and potential customers, it's very similar there as well. And ultimately, why is that important? Well, attackers follow the data. So, using proven techniques, things like theft, ransomware, fraud, pivoting from even greater access or lateral spread via, perceived trusted communication channels, right? Assuming somebody's role, and now you're not seen as a threat, but you're trusted because you're on the inside. These things are inevitable because this is where the data sets. And so the changes with, work from home, for example, has fostered, a lot of different ways to basically get at the data. So how big of a problem? Well, these numbers are really kind of started showing up in 2019 and 2020. So this was when, account takeover was just sort of, cresting and becoming something that was sort of on people's radar. But we've not seen, really a significant drop in these, in the data. 40% of companies have experienced, to some degree, some type of Office 365 account takeover. So what constitutes account takeover in Office 365? So we are constantly hearing about things like phishing, which is a method of infection, how an adversary eventually gets onto some device or getting someone to click on something to initiate or install some type of code or to steal a password or content. But account takeover is slightly different. This is the concept of essentially stealing a person's user identity and then being able to use that identity to impersonate them in order to access any resources associated with that individual. Now, account takeover can occur within any software as a service or application. And the idea being is if I can take over an account and impersonate a user, I have the same freedom of access as that user within the service. And so that becomes a very challenging scenario to detect because the behavior is not really that different from a typical user. Um, and with a legitimate account, you can just imagine what's potentially possible in Office 365. So definitely, it's a growing problem. In response to account takeover, the market typically responds with sort of this generic use multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. That is sort of the default. Here's how you protect yourself. Now, I agree that at a minimum, everyone should deploy multi-factor authentication. It's a good call for what I call covering the basics. But the reality, it's not enough, and I'll explain where there are some obvious shortcomings. And at a high level, there are three ways people are getting around multi-factor authentication with Office 365. There's this concept of legacy protocols. So if I've got interoperability challenges, I can always default back to some legacy protocols to get the job done. Malicious Azure apps that are oftentimes used to facilitate an attacker's persistence is another way. And then probably this will resonate with most, the idea of I'm just going to stay signed in, right? I'm going to leverage that because it's a productivity feature, but it also poses additional risks. So those three things are some things related to multi-factor, right? So multi-factor is built with current services in mind. So again, does not support some of the legacy protocols. So if I have to default to legacy protocols, I can't engage multi-factor. All of a sudden, multi-factor is not a gate that I have to jump over or through in order to get access. Apps with permissions can leverage, for example, OAuth to bypass multi-factor authentication and persist, across a password reset. So even though somebody's reset their password, if I'm in, I've got a certain amount of time and that password reset does not affect my persistence. And then, it's a convenience to not have to kind of constantly log in to access my Office 365 environment. And so sometimes we'll leverage that, stay signed in feature to save us a couple keystrokes. But this allows attackers to fairly easily pivot through an already authorized system. So you think about it, if that status is always signed in, there are some security preventative measures that are excluded automatically because they're already in the system and they remain unchallenged. So if I can figure a way to get in after an authentication session, then multi-factor really does not provide me any value at that point. And so that's a little bit of the challenge. And again, although multi-factor is something you should do, it's definitely not foolproof. So couple this idea of a potential persistent token, throw this against sort of the concept of your home network. And it's not the same. And the reason I'm thinking through this is, it's not the same as your best of breed security and infrastructure sitting in, the enterprise. When you think about what we've been forced to kind of deal with work from home over the last couple of years, obviously by any means, even with the latest gadgets. And if you're anything like me, you're often more than willing to pay the extra bucks to get, the advanced features. But unfortunately, if you're like me as well, oftentimes you are typically only leveraging about 20% of that, it's an 80-20 rule, right? 20% of the capability you're actually, deployed and leveraging. And that's typically, what most home kind of networks sort of look like. Even though you spend the extra to get the additional coverage, it's only partial at best. And so nobody was really ready to kind of turn their home networks into enterprise class security enclaves with how we, have all kind of reinvented our home offices given, our experience through this pandemic. And then, I get kind of dirty stares from family and my wife when I ask, friends who want to jump on, my home network to maybe, connect their iPhone or their mobile. And I ask them to make sure that they attach only to the guest network. And oh, by the way, it's a 25 character passphrase, you know, so even though I attempt to do some limited security, it's practical use sometimes is more challenging than we're comfortable kind of enforcing. So here's an example of details we've seen, for example, for a bypass attack. Um, if I can start with a compromised account, so it could be something as simple as poisoning or traditional phishing exploit. We don't really care how it happens, but once I sort of have access to the local network, and once I'm essentially as an attacker on the inside, again, there's this perceived trust, and that camouflage of perceived trust, basically allows for a lot of defenses to come right down because I've kind of assumed somebody's role. Most folks do not have any kind of sophisticated coverage for Office 365, or even extrapolate this further to cloud when it comes to really looking for behavioral type of advanced persistent threat. So when it comes to detecting these type of attacks, an attacker is only required to execute a very limited number of maneuvers before they can fully move into, for example, Office 365 to get to their objective. And you can kind of see here, just based on this bypass SaaS attack, that there's only a couple steps where the adversary is actually on the physical local network before they try to pivot. And then once they're in Office 365, they can move fairly quickly to their objective and stay relatively hidden, because the behaviors that they're demonstrating, they're not as nefarious as we'd like to perceive. They actually are oftentimes using certain features built into Office 365 to accomplish kind of their objectives. And so it's hard to find attackers, once they transition into cloud or SaaS, and that's just because of the complexity of the an inherent complexity of the environment. Security is one of the first things that has suffered with the kind of forced fast transition and transformation that was sort of created by the pandemic, and it's a kind of a good reminder, and a prime example that the pressure to get kind of stuff done and get done quickly so that we can keep the business moving, pushes security a little bit to an afterthought. But I do think that this is finally, to some degree, being addressed as we kind of hope to transition out of the pandemic. But these types of oversights are, why we still see, the cost of, incidents and breaches still increasing. So let's talk, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about some Office 365 attacker tactics. And we're going to drill into some very common ones, things that you would probably recognize that attackers can use to kind of to their advantage once they're on the inside and they've taken over an account. So these are very common kind of tricks. Here are some of the more what I call obvious things attackers can leverage. Something as simple as search, but if you take a search mechanism and you apply that across all of your emails, all your records within Teams, files, for example, for passwords or any financial data, any kind of patent, IP, intellectual property information, source code, etc. You can see how search utilized by worthy adversary that has a very specific objective can be actually an extremely powerful tool. So oftentimes when we're looking for adversarial behavior, we're not considering or thinking about some of the built-in capabilities that are leveraged in something as simple as search. The idea that you can set up email forwarding rules for ongoing visibility or even email rules that would suppress emails from intended recipients. Again, all to potentially further an adversary's persistence within Office 365 once they've taken over an account. Obviously, things like fraud via trusted communications to either customers or internal users. I think we're all cognizant of the fact that when we get an email from an external sender, our security haunches sort of go up a little bit, and we understand posture related to that. But as soon as we have an adversary that's taken over an account, and they're actually exchanging emails, and those are considered internal. Again, it's this perceived trust, so it's not the same kind of awareness that we would naturally have if it was an external sender. Obviously, things I mentioned before, watering hole attacks, poisoning common files, and having those easily distributed. That's very, very kind of common type of, first a way that an attacker can get in. We're all very familiar with ransomware. This is, obviously in the last year or so, this has hit the news fairly heavily. It's in the news again and again, and it's kind of an interesting statistic in how ransomware, especially in the last year or so, has kind of mucked around with the average dwell time. So probably 2 years, year and a half ago, the average dwell time for attackers within an environment, I used on a regular basis in talking to some of my constituents would be, 100 days of dwell time was very common in a lot of, exploits or, potential breaches or incidents. But what's interesting is with the sharp rise in ransomware, especially in the last 9 to 12 months, one of the things that the ransomware is doing that's slightly different. It's actually if you're an adversary and ransom operations is sort of your target and your MO, what you're going to do as soon as you get set up, the very first thing you want to do is announce your presence, right? So the average dwell time has dropped to, I think the latest stats I've sort of heard is around 56 days. But I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. I think that is potentially has been influenced by ransomware operations to some degree. Again, because the objective is to kind of let they're there as soon as they're ready to go, right? Exfiltration on high value email data via mail forwarding, being able to set up a auto discovery search rule, for example, be able to look through any kind of archived data for something. Could be something like a patent or a source code, then being able to set up a rule that copies that out to a share, and then every time there's a updated result of that search, again, it gets kind of recursive copied, and then potentially that gets outputted or shared to some drive that is externally accessible to an adversary. And so that's just a rule put in place that's automated, and that can be done very easily once somebody has taken over an account. So these are more, those are more kind of common tactics that you'll see. But let's drill into what we were talking about a little bit on, for example, on the legacy protocols. And when we talked a little bit before, we had mentioned legacy protocols being used by to specifically bypass multi-factor authentication. So here's actually a specific tool that was leveraged against a MAPI service, and the goal was to basically allow the adversary to pivot from Office 365 to the endpoint to then further the attack on the network. So in this situation, they were leveraging Office 365 to basically find a way into the actual network. Multi-factor again is built really with current services in mind, not necessarily addressing compatibility for legacy applications. So if multi-factor is not working for certain things, there is the option, and it's really today it's a default to basically allow multi-factor to be bypassed in order to address compatibility for older legacy apps. And so that's a problem because attackers understand that. Attackers can, in some situations, force that. Right? Webmail, for example, fairly easy to kind of exploit that. The one good thing is there's some stuff happening in this year where Microsoft is changing some of the default settings, but as a result, Microsoft kind of generically, until they make these changes, they've kind of often they leave these protocols on to support those legacy apps. So it's really up to you and your organization to be able to actually turn off or disable those legacy protocols that pose a potential risk. Now that sounds easy, but an email administrator does not necessarily always understand those dependencies. So it's a very collaborative type of engagement to make sure that you're disabling what's appropriate for an environment, and extrapolate that to a larger enterprise, even more complicated, right? So this is actually, I think changing, like I mentioned, this year with Microsoft taking the stance that they're going to disable by default legacy protocols for backwards compatibility. So they'll disable it, and it's up to you to then enable what's required. And I think that's a positive step forward. But the whole idea is you've got to be aware. Do I have the older legacy protocols running for backwards compatibility? Are those active in my environment? Are they required? And then am I potentially at risk because of, adversaries can leverage a way around multi-factor because of that. So the whole idea is this makes full coverage for multi-factor kind of a real challenge in practice. It's good on paper, but actually operationalizing it is, I think, harder than people realize at times. Another common tactic for bypassing multi-factor is trick users, is this idea of being able to kind of trick users into installing a malicious, for example, OAuth app. And these are extremely powerful. And once installed, they basically give the attacker access for 90 days with no additional authentication challenge. So the attacker has a valid token, and this is the scenario I mentioned before. Even if the password's changed, they're in there for 90 days regardless. And you may wonder who would be foolish enough to install one of these apps. And one thing I've learned in security is never underestimate the power of social engineering and the lure of the concept of what I call ease of use, to get people to do things without really thinking through too much about what they're actually really doing. So it's not as hard as people think, but in certain cases, some of these apps creates some big issues. This is an example of a malicious Azure app. You probably, if you follow the news, security news worldwide in any way, you probably heard about this. But this example, there was this tactic was featured in a campaign against. It was targeted against several Australian companies. And it was widely attributed to specific Chinese hacker groups. But it was a social engineering trick and that was used, and it basically to spoof an app from MailGuard 365, which was a widely used security tool within these target organizations. So obviously they had done some reconnaissance, they understood this, and so they spoofed this app. But the users thought they were actually doing the right thing to improve their security posture by installing this app. So if you want to even further the adoption of a malicious app, just tie the word security or the concept of security around it, and you'll have folks lining up to install it. So instead, they were basically getting owned. And then once installed, the attackers really were able to create persistence in terms of access, and they could basically read user profiles as well as read and manipulate emails. Attackers also, like to live off the land. So this is, one of the aims. They want to be able to get into an environment And because it's not necessarily an environment they fully understand, they want to be able to, persist or dwell as long as possible, so they can, find the, best path to some kind of domain control or, escalated privilege, and then some, content of value. And so, living out the land. Is one of the techniques, and essentially using built-in tools to remain hidden, especially within Office 365, is very much a concern. And it's no real different within Office 365 than kind of your typical enterprise networks. One example is using, Office 365 e-discovery. So a built-in available tool within Office 365, and the e-discovery capabilities enables you to be able to address kind of rapid search for targeted information. So think of giving yourself the ability to search within your organization for certain things like a password or a financial purchase order, or whatever it could be, source code, could be, anything, any kind of a patent, any meaningful content. But being able to create that search and then apply that search across all your SharePoint, all your OneDrive, all your OneNote notebooks in a single command. It's extremely powerful, and yet that is sort of built into the Office 365 environment. Then you take that concept, and if an adversary is in there, all they have to do is sort of set up that search in a kind of a recursive rule that deposited, the results of that search in terms of data, into, another share. And then over time, duplicate that share every time there's an update to it. They move that data, and they can automate, once they've sort of set that process up, they can automate that entire process, even, pushing that information externally. And we'll talk a little bit about that next here. And the way that they do sort of that automation is something referred to as Power Automate. So this is a tool within, again, the Office 365 environment. If you're a network person, and you've done any kind of recursive administrative processes and have leveraged PowerShell, Power Automate within Office 365 is very similar in terms of it gives you sort of super administrative capabilities, and it's a very powerful tool. It's another way that adversaries within Office 365 will sort of live off the land. And to kind of delve into this a little bit, Power Automate was really created to automate simple day-to-day user tasks like managing email attachments or approval flows. It's enabled by default in Office 365 tenants, and it can do amazing things, not just for users, but attackers as well. And it's, again, once it's being used, you've got to look for very, very specific behavioral type things to distinguish whether it's being used for good or for bad. But it can be used for things from an adversarial standpoint. It could be used for doing things like connecting over an HTTP to a C2 in order to send data out. It can also be used automatically to sync OneDrive files to an attacker-owned, for example, Google Drive, on whenever there's a modification to kind of that search result. Or we've seen this on certain attacks. It could be tied to automating, tweeting all emails that include specific keywords. And the thing that's important to understand is that within Office 365, there's over 350 application connectors available for Office 365 users, and there's more being created and added every day, every week. And so those connectors are really what it creates that automation process behind Power Automate, as far as taking a workflow or a process and literally making it 100%, creating an automated process 100%, where once it's set up, it continues to run by itself. The attacker doesn't even have to monitor it at that point. And the other thing that's interesting is, because Power Automate is an app that's technically authorized it can bypass DLP and other standard security controls. So that's the difficulty, is we're using these built-in tools for nefarious reasons, and it's very hard to distinguish. Again, is it being used for good or for bad? So here's an interesting, kind of stat. And these techniques are, actively being used, in the wild today. Here's a scenario where Microsoft published an example, an advanced attacker who used these live off the land techniques to maintain, complete Office 365 access for 213 days. So, they work, and they're hard to detect, to distinguish, again, when people are using them. And they use e-discovery to find data and Power Automate, to exfiltrate the content of interest. But 213 days within, the account before they were discovered. It may be surprising, but Microsoft's security suite doesn't really offer any kind of coverage for finding, things like the malicious Power Automate usage. The security kind of controls within Office 365 are very much focused on other aspects of security, rather than some of this granular behavioral detail. Nor do they give, again, the type of controls over which connectors, for example, can be used, or by which users are actually using them. Within Office 365, it's very typical they just get, a toggle capability to turn on or turn off the ability for a user to have access to Power Automate, but not the granular controls associated with can they incorporate, potential, controllers where, they potentially have a security concern. There's not that granular level of scrutiny. So they simply recommend enabling, again, the standard responses enable multi-factor authentication, which by now you should recognize just does not cover the bases when it comes to, a stealthy adversary. I'm going to flush these out, and we're going to look at specifically the SaaS one. But this behavioral approach is, I think, what's different about, the threat research and sort of what we do at Vectra. And if we were to kind of keep this talk track around, SaaS, specifically Microsoft 365, when we talk about the example that we were just looking at, when we talk about Power Automate, what we're really trying to do is look deep into kind of the native functionality rather than just treating, Power Automate like any other app. And so the method we do to kind of address that from a security research standpoint is, for example, Power Automate in Microsoft 365, like I mentioned, is like PowerShell in terms of network. But we really, to get an understanding, you must deeply analyze how it's being used. And you've got to pay special attention or focus on the connectors. And the connectors are what is most valuable to the attackers. And that's what allows them to kind of create, if you will, a workflow where they can kind of automate, something like an exfil process, and basically have that run hands off. And again, our approach in leveraging, the data science aspect is we're really trying to understand how Power Automate connectors are used, at an account and tenant level. So we want to kind of understand what is normal, and how typical users in, accounts and tenant levels are using it. And then what we're going to look for is potentially abuses that are slightly different than that. And that is obviously looking for any kind of unusual flows. And then again, with the connectors, if they have any kind of security relevant aspect to it, it's going to be something that we scrutinize. So just to give you an idea of how we sort of kind of approach addressing that. All right, so if you had a compromised Office 365 environment, would you know it? And I'm looking at our time. We've got about, I'm going to try to speed through some of this just to kind of wrap up the last 5 minutes here, so we have a few minutes for kind of question and answers. But at a real high level, this is more about kind of the approach that you've got to take to be able to significantly understand what's kind of happening. And the trick to understand the correct way to apply, for example, machine learning or the data science aspect of this, is, what is the problem that I'm actually trying to solve? And just like a carpenter would, bring the right tool if he's got to drive a nail versus fasten a screw. Same thing with data science. Am I trying to detect a hidden HDB tunnel? It pays to have the right algorithm or machine learning model at a very granular level to do the right kind of job. And so this is what we've done to try to build a platform to look at attacks from this behavioral perspective. And all I mean when I talk about behavior is really common methods. So, what the threat is actually doing. And it provides really, when you look at this, there's all kinds of ways that we can get at, potential active attacks within our environment. The challenge is many of these things that we've done traditionally in security just don't have durability. Think of something as simple as a signature. I change a bit and then I've got a different signature. The attacker understands that, and so it's constantly sort of this cat and mouse. But if I can distill certain behaviors that have a high or longer durability in terms of persistent, they have value, right? And I'll use an example of worm-like replication. The first internet worm that leveraged replication was something like, I don't know, close to 10, 15 years ago. But those replication behaviors still being used today by attackers. Why? Because they're effective. And they haven't quite figured a way to do the same, method or common method any cheaper. They're entrepreneurs just as much as we are. And so, Vectra kind of has adopted this philosophy of kind of implementing the most optimal kind of machine learning tool for each specific attacker behavior. Each method, has its own strengths. But the basic idea is that we want to get at something that's durable. And then I'm going to mention this, and then I'll move through this. We often reference MITRE. And if you're not familiar with MITRE, it's quasi-governmental organization, but it's a nonprofit that came out. Kind of the first project they did was sort of a missile to air defense in the 50s. A rumor has it that project that they developed, actually, the federal government spent more money on that than they did with some of the nuclear development that we did, around World War II with the Manhattan Project. Another little tidbit is MITRE was the first registered company with the .org domain. And then probably what's more relevant to what for security practitioners or IT today is they help develop the STIX. So STIX is just a format for sharing, threat intel information. So if you've heard open source or consume, a threat feed into a platform to help identify known bad, STIX is a format which makes that easy to do. And then both the attack and defend are relatively new. Attack is a way of creating language around common methods of attacks, and then defend is really the flip side of that, creating kind of a common language to address what defenders do to prevent attacks, and then building sort of this idea of coverage within an environment. And so MITRE at a high level consumes content around actors, how they access environments, and the tools they use. There's a lot of security research that comes kind of through that examination, and they have kind of created, again, the MITRE attack, MITRE defend. And this is, again, just getting to kind of a common language around methods. Attack is a framework for naming attacker behaviors that progress and evade defenders. And then the defend is a framework for sort of naming defender behaviors that stop and prevent attackers. And so it's a third party. It's good to kind of understand the language of attacks, and that's why I kind of like to highlight what they're doing. Because as security practitioners, it gives us kind of a dictionary, if you will, to talk about some of these challenging, behaviors that we're trying to characterize that are being used by attackers. And then on the flip side, certain types of defensive behaviors that we'll use to kind of prevent or shut down those attacks. And if you look at sort of what we saw before in terms of hash values, fairly trivial, but if you work your way up, these tactics, techniques, and procedures are what we kind of refer to as common methods, TTPs. If you kind of distill these down, instead of talking about millions of different things, you can develop a language really around about more like hundreds of things. And so it allows us to, as security practitioners, kind of figure a kind of consistent means of communicating around attacks, and then for the defend, kind of the flip side of that, kind of defensive maneuvers that we do to prevent attacks. And this, when I talk about what Vectra is kind of doing, we are in many ways trying to mirror that understanding of coverage when it comes to both the MITRE attack and then the MITRE defend. And when we specifically look at this sort of MITRE matrix for Office 365, we sort of reference these behaviors as detections. And so what we do is we fold those into areas of coverage that MITRE says is important to ensure that you've got a posture when it comes to security, that you're protected. And so these, when we first released the Office 365 capabilities within our platform for detecting, the behaviors that we've talked about, through this presentation, I think introduced about 25 different ones. I think we're probably closer between 50 to 75 different types of behaviors within Office 365, where we're saying, look, this is suspicious. This is something that you should consider digging into. And this is just people talk about mapping, what you're able to detect back into MITRE framework. And again, because it's a common language in which you can talk about TTPs and the coverage for those TTPs. So if I kind of look at this from a detect, being able to detect malicious access to kind of any federated application associated, when we talk about Office 365 capabilities, we're really talking about, Active Directory as well as Office 365. And this is just a little bit of a mapping of some of the detections that we hit on the AD side. And then, if I was to add the Office 365, some of the additional ones, just to give you sort of an idea. If I was to go a little bit further and sort of map these out, I've got, the associated attacker behaviors, the actual MITRE attack framework. And MITRE uses a series of what they call T numbers. And you can drill into any one of these on the MITRE website, and you can get sort of the historic understanding of what these types of attacks or behaviors or coverage involved. And again, this is sort of that common methods language that MITRE is developing. And so we basically look at the attacker behavior, we map that to the framework that MITRE is using to kind of communicate that language of the attack or of the defense. And then in this case, this is how we kind of bubble up what we refer to as our detections. So you can kind of see that. And then this is another view of that, sort of a maybe a little bit more simple, but these are the tactics that are used. And this is very much aspects or categories of an attack lifecycle or the kill chain. And these are some of the actual behaviors that we'll see in terms of examples what we'll cover within Office 365 in terms of what we're finding related to those categories. I'm just going to put this up here, and this is mainly to kind of show you that in terms of prevalence of Office 365 attacker behaviors, we've done several reports over the years with the data that we basically have from our customers and prospects, and probably the biggest trend that we find is within Office 365, lateral movement is huge. It's used to pivot. Again, Solar Gate, Solar Winds, you saw that it was used to pivot, between cloud and network. So it's important to kind of know that once in, it's very hard to detect, and it's typically leveraged to be, lateral in many ways. I'm
Hey,
not
hey,
going to go.
Michael.
Yep, yep, yep.
Real fast. I don't want to interrupt for more than a second, but we are going to launch a poll real fast. It's
Yes.
very, very simple.
Okay.
It's about doing. It's really just about meeting in person.
Yes.
I'm going to launch it. Gather the data. Feel free. You can keep going. Just wanted to let everyone know.
Yes. So I think I've got two more slides, so I appreciate that. This is just, I've got a couple case studies, but the main takeaway here is just looking at, the progression of an attack. And one of the things that we try to do is, when we identify a detection, the detection is always either correlated to an account or if it's on the network, a host. So you never get an alert just based on the detection. It's always associated again with either a system or an account. And what drives, and it's really based on a concept of a threat uncertainty score. And what is important to understand is what we're really after is seeing the progression of some advanced persistent threat. We want to see that progression. Otherwise, if it's a system that's got a series of port scans, or maybe there was maybe there was an email rule that was created and then nothing else associated with that account. Even though that's interesting contextual data, unless we see the progression of activity, and all I mean by progression is, are we moving through, that attack sequence? So command and control, do we move from command and control to some kind of reconnaissance, to some kind of lateral movement, to staging interesting content or data for exfil, right? So if I see that progression, it's definitely warranting some type of advanced attack. And so here's a case study with DocuSign, and here's from a detection standpoint. We went through this process. This is what we saw, in that particular scenario. I have one other, and then I think this one was unique, especially because it was a research university, and this was during COVID. And I think they were actually doing COVID related work. And so, at the time, personally, I kept hearing there was a lot of activity around just trying to get information, research information around that. And so, here are some things that we're seeing associated with that. Now, the last thing I was just going to mention before I kind of wrap up is, Vectra made an interesting acquisition in the first of this year, and this is significant because it does relate very much to Microsoft 365 and that environment, but it is within Office 365 or Microsoft 365, within that environment. There's something like 7,500 plus settings. If you think of that as an administrator, it can be absolutely overwhelming. And to have that sort of dialed in to make sure that it's as secure as possible, super challenging. The acquisition we made was probably the simplest way to understand it is the only vulnerability scanner for M365 from a posture management standpoint. And we partnered heavily with the Sirius was the acquisition that Vectra made, and it was done with a lot of kind of direct interaction with Microsoft. Not something they wanted to focus on, but something they felt was extremely extremely helpful for their constituents to be able to understand how at the end of the day their environment is configured. And staying on top of this, those types of things is a full-time job. It requires a lot of knowledge around 365 APIs and security know-how. Again, 7,500 plus settings, and they're not visible from the Office admin portal. So it's a monumental task, but it's something, again, it's around posture, security posture, and it runs a series of scans and produces reports to give you a very clear snapshot of where your configuration is set. So it's a super valuable tool. And then last slide, again, appreciate the time. I'm just coming a couple minutes over, I apologize. But really the net of what I want to end here with is, organizations suffer from account takeover, and it's a common thing. In order to stop a breach, it's important to understand, attacker behaviors and account privileges and how they're kind of being used or abused within an environment. Attackers will continue to kind of actively pursue ways to pivot between, the on-prem environments, data center, your infrastructure as a service, as well as, Office 365 or your SaaS environments. Again, I can't emphasize how much, behavior models are an effective way to kind of find attackers who are able to kind of bypass common and traditional defenses. And that's really the platform that Vectra has built. Office 365 and account takeover is a very real thing. And I think it's interesting that it's, not as in terms of some of the live off the land and some of the built-in capabilities there. It's not obvious that those things are being used and abused based on attacker objectives, but that's absolutely what's happening, and that is part of the reason it is extremely difficult to distinguish that behavior from normal users, because those features and capabilities are often available to all users or all accounts within an Office 365 tenancy. So I'll end there. I'll stop. I'll pause. If there are any questions, I'm happy to kind of stay on and address that. But I just want to say thank you again for an opportunity to kind of present to you guys, talk a little bit about account takeover within Office 365. Hopefully it's been beneficial. Hopefully somebody, I always believe, hopefully if you've walked away learning a little bit of something, you've spent some time investing in yourself, and it's a good thing. So again, appreciate the opportunity to talk to the group here in Seattle.